What if the mysterious woman described in the book of Revelation is not simply a symbol of an ancient city? What if she represents a nation? And what if that nation is Ethiopia? Revelation chapter 17 describes a woman sitting upon a scarlet beast, wearing purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones, and holding a golden cup. She is called Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. But Revelation also says something fascinating. The woman sits upon many waters, and those waters represent peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So who is this woman? Many biblical interpreters identify her with Rome or another historical power. But there is another interpretation, one that connects the mysterious woman with Ethiopia. In this video, we will examine the biblical passages and historical traditions behind this theory. Revelation chapter 17 presents one of the most mysterious visions in the Bible. John says that he was carried away in the Spirit into a wilderness. There he saw a woman sitting upon a scarlet-colored beast. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet. She was covered with gold, precious stones, and pearls. And in her hand was a golden cup filled with abominations. On her forehead was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great. The vision becomes even more dramatic. John sees the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. Then the angel explains that the waters where the woman sits represent peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Finally, the angel says, The woman which thou sawest is that great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth. But could this woman represent more than a city? Could she symbolize a nation in its history? That is where the Ethiopia interpretation begins. The first connection is the image of a powerful woman associated with the south. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12, The queen of the south shall rise up in the judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it. The queen of the south has traditionally been connected with the queen of Sheba. In Ethiopian tradition, she is known as Makeda. She is remembered as a powerful queen associated with the ancient kingdom of Sheba and with Ethiopia's royal tradition. For supporters of the Ethiopia interpretation, this is significant. They see the biblical image of a great woman, a queen from the south, as a possible symbolic connection to a nation represented by a woman. But there is an important distinction. Matthew does not explicitly say that the queen of the south represents Ethiopia. The connection comes from interpretation and Ethiopian tradition. So the question becomes, could the biblical imagery of the woman point beyond one individual queen, to a nation in its history? The second connection concerns suffering. In Revelation, the woman eventually experiences destruction. The kings represented by the horns turn against her. She is stripped, devastated, and burned with fire. Supporters of the Ethiopia interpretation compare this imagery with biblical passages describing the suffering, humiliation, and destruction of Ethiopia. One passage often discussed is found in Isaiah chapter 20. There, Isaiah gives a sign concerning Egypt and Ethiopia, describing captives being led away naked and barefoot. Another passage sometimes connected with this theory is found in 2 Chronicles chapter 14. The Bible describes a large Ethiopian army coming against Judah. The Ethiopian forces were defeated before the Lord. The passage says they were pursued and that they fell so that none remained alive. For the Ethiopia interpretation, this becomes another example of a recurring biblical theme. Ethiopia experiences conflict, defeat, and suffering, but its story does not disappear from Scripture. The interpretation connects these ancient passages with the larger prophetic imagery of Revelation. However, there is an important historical question concerning the locations mentioned in these passages. Ancient biblical geography does not necessarily correspond directly to modern Ethiopian place names. Therefore, claims identifying ancient Gerar or other biblical locations with modern Addis Ababa, Mount Ur, or Ariful should be treated as a theory rather than established historical fact. The larger question remains, why does Ethiopia appear repeatedly in biblical prophecy? Isaiah contains several passages that mention Ethiopia, or Cush in many translations. Isaiah chapter 20 describes Ethiopia in the context of captivity and humiliation. Isaiah also uses powerful imagery of judgment, fire, and destruction. To those who support the Ethiopia interpretation, these passages seem to echo the imagery of Revelation 17. The woman in Revelation is humiliated. Ethiopia is described in prophetic passages as experiencing humiliation. The woman is attacked by kings. Ethiopia appears in biblical prophecies involving powerful kingdoms. The woman faces destruction. Ethiopia also appears in passages describing judgment. But again, we should separate what Scripture explicitly says from what later interpreters connect together. The Bible never directly states, "The woman of Revelation is Ethiopia." That is the central claim of this theory, and it must be examined carefully. But the story does not end with destruction. This is where the interpretation takes another dramatic turn. The Bible contains passages that speak positively about Ethiopia. Psalm 68 contains the famous statement, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." For many readers, this is a powerful image. Ethiopia stretching out her hands toward God. And in Psalm 68, God's enemies are ultimately defeated. Supporters of the Ethiopia interpretation see this as a possible picture of restoration. The nation that suffered eventually turns toward God. The enemies are defeated. And God's purposes prevail. This creates a symbolic journey. Power, suffering, destruction, and finally, restoration. There is another fascinating connection sometimes made with the Queen of Sheba tradition. The Song of Songs contains poetic imagery of a garden, a locked garden, and a sealed spring. Some interpreters connect these images symbolically with the Queen of the South and her journey toward Solomon. Solomon was famous for his wisdom and peace. And in Christian interpretation, Solomon can sometimes be understood as a symbolic foreshadowing of Christ, the King of Peace. The Queen comes from the South to hear Solomon's wisdom. And Jesus himself later refers to the Queen of the South. For the Ethiopia theory, these connections create a larger symbolic picture. A woman from the South. A powerful kingdom. A journey toward wisdom and peace. And finally, a nation turning toward God. But again, these are theological connections and interpretations, not explicit statements that the Bible identifies Ethiopia as Revelation's woman. And then comes the central message of Revelation. The beast and the kings make war against the Lamb. But the Lamb overcomes them. Why? Because he is Lord of Lords, and King of Kings. Whatever interpretation we choose for the woman, the final message of Revelation is not about the ultimate victory of the beast. It is about the victory of the Lamb. For those who believe the woman represents Ethiopia, this can be interpreted as a promise that Ethiopia's suffering will not have the final word. The final word belongs to God. So, is the woman of Revelation actually Ethiopia? The traditional interpretation points toward Babylon, Rome, or a symbolic system of political and religious power. The Ethiopia interpretation looks at another collection of biblical passages. The Queen of the South. The Ethiopian Kingdom. Prophecies concerning Cush. Ethiopia's suffering. Ethiopia stretching out her hands to God. And the ultimate victory of the Lamb. When these passages are placed together, supporters of the theory see a prophetic story. A woman. A kingdom. A period of greatness. A time of suffering. And finally, restoration. But there is still one major question. If the woman represents Ethiopia, who are the 7 heads of the beast? And what do the 10 horns represent? Could these symbols correspond to specific kings and kingdoms? And how does this interpretation relate to Ethiopia's modern political history? That is where the story becomes even more controversial. In part 2, we will examine the 7 heads, and the claim that they can be connected with 7 Ethiopian rulers. And one of the names discussed in this interpretation is Ethiopia's current Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed. Is this biblical prophecy? Or is it a modern interpretation being placed onto an ancient text? Watch part 2 to examine the evidence.